Good evening, everyone. It is Tuesday, February 27th, 2024, and the board meeting is being called to order at 6 o'clock today for a work session. Don't know that we have all board members present. We have the majority of board members present, including some of our budget committee members this evening, which we'd like to go ahead and name. We have Laura Millian, Catherine Jones, Patrick Schwab, and Kelly Strong joining us this evening from our budget committee, and then have Director Nicholas Pressey, Director Richardson, Director Chandra Green, Second Vice Chair Carson Cottingham also here this evening. I'd like to hand it off at this time to Director Chandragiri for the land acknowledgement, if you may.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. The land acknowledgement. We are gathered today on the land of the Kalapuya, who are represented by the Confederate Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederate Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The relationship between the Kalapuya people and this land continues unbroken to this day. And we offer gratitude for the land and for the generations present and past who have stewarded the land since time immemorial. We respectfully acknowledge and honor past, present, and future Native American and Indigenous students and staff of Salem-Keizer Public Schools. We invite you to join us in honoring these ancestral grounds and celebrating the resilience and strength of all Native American and Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chandragiri. Now, if you will rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Welcome, Director Hudson. Thanks for joining us. We have Dr. West with us this evening and will lead us through this conversation. Just want to check if there are any agenda modifications for the evening.
No modifications to the agenda.
All right. Well, once again, just huge welcome to everyone. Thanks for board members who are joining and tapping into this conversation to once again look through the nuts and bolts of budgets, and to our newer budget committee members as well for joining in and really wanting to have this first conversation and initiation in terms of what does school finance look like, what are the funding sources, what are the allowable uses of some of these funds, and have this as an opportunity to ask questions before we dive into further budget committee meetings and more details. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Dr. West for the evening. And would you like for us to, in terms of taking questions, I wanted to just check with you if there's an approach that you'd prefer.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a couple of points in our presentation where we will stop, and I'm co-presenting tonight with Bob Silva, our Chief Operations Officer. So we'll be flipping back and forth between the two of us. And as I said, there'll be a couple of points where we'll stop. We will collect your questions. We are collecting the questions so that we can build out other presentations that will follow this. Many of you remember, if you participated last year or watched last year, that we held several brown bag seminars. We intend to do the same thing again so that we can support your learning prior to getting into the official budget season and the budget approval process. So we'll collect those questions, write them down. When we pause, we'll ask for them. Chair, unless you have anything else to say, I'm going to jump right in.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Again, I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives, and Bob Silver, our Chief Operations Officer, will be presenting with me tonight. The purpose of tonight is to share with you a very high-level introduction to school budgeting. We're going to introduce you to some vocabulary. We're going to introduce you to some different funding sources that we have access to. And talk a little bit about how schools receive money from the state of Oregon, so that you have some context for a conversation that is becoming louder and more prevalent in our state as well. Superintendent Castaneda couldn't be here with us tonight. I'm sure that she will pick this up later on and contribute to the conversation. But this will at least get us started and working in the direction of being prepared to establish a budget for the 24-25 school year. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right into our first slide, which is vocabulary. And our Chief Operations Officer, Bob Silva, will walk us through some vocabulary that is really important for us to understand before we get any further into this conversation.
All right. Good evening, everyone. For people on the Zoom call, we posted a link to the budget book that's on the district website. And for anybody watching online, you can use the QR code to load up the budget book and follow along. So let's start with vocabulary that we use in school district budgeting. You will find a glossary of many of these terms, plus some additional ones, starting on page 199. And I do want to point out a slight difference between the electronic version of the budget book and the printed version of the budget book. They're about one page off. So page 199 is on the electronic one, the start of the glossary, and on the printed one, it's page 200. So whenever you see a page referenced, go ahead and just get to that page or the one after, and you'll get to the section we're talking about. All right, so let's go ahead and start with allocation. And I'm going to actually read the definitions from the glossary and then add on some references if there's correlations to the budget book. If you just want to take notes to those, you may not have time to flip to all the pages that I mentioned, but I wanted you to be able to correlate some of these definitions to where they appear in the budget book. So first thing is allocation, which is simply to divide an appropriation into amounts for specific purposes. So this has two meanings in our budgeting process. The first is the state appropriation and subsequent allocation of funding to schools. And then at the district level, it's the appropriation of the state funding and other revenue sources, and then the allocation into different function and object codes within the general fund budget and other funds. So beginning fund balance, that is simply the funds that are carried forward from the current fiscal year into the next budgeted fiscal year that become a resource to support the appropriations for the next budgeted fiscal year. The beginning fund balance is the same amount as the previous year's ending fund balance. So in the budget book, when you look at page 49 of the general fund, you'll see the beginning fund balance notated there, and that's added to our resources available and plays into the total general fund budget. And again, the ending fund balance from the previous year rolls over into the beginning fund balance of the budgeting year. Next definition is contingency, which is a special amount budgeted each year for unforeseen expenditures. Transfer of general fund contingency funds to cover unanticipated expenditures requires board approval. So once all the funds are budgeted, financial policy, ADM A001, requires a contingency no less than 3% of the general fund budget. And again, that's the amount of money that's kind of like the safety net for the school district. So once all the other funds are appropriated, including the contingency, if we, have a global pandemic or something like that and have to incur additional expenses beyond what was appropriated during the budget process, we would execute a board action to use those funds and transfer them from the contingency into the general fund for use. But those are usually for unexpected or emergency scenarios. Debt service is a term that's not listed directly in the glossary, but it's essentially the amount of money needed to cover payments on a debt for a particular time period. So where you'll see that represented in our budget book is in the pages for Fund 300, specifically Fund 307 and 308, starting on page 154. That's the debt service or the payments on our debt for our PERS bonds that we sold several years ago, as well as our general obligation bonds. So this is paying back those bonds. Next up is deficit, which is simply the excess of liabilities of a fund over its assets. Just for everybody's reference, in Oregon, school districts may not carry deficits in any fund. So everything needs to be appropriated and budgeted and spent within that budgeted amount. If there's a reason to go over, it requires board action, usually through some unexpected expense or emergency where we would ask to transfer funds from the general fund. But that's in extenuating circumstances that we would do that. So the ending fund balance of the current fiscal year becomes the beginning fund balance of the next fiscal year. The fund balance is made up of two components. One is any unexpended budget. That is the budget expenditure minus actual. So let's say we budget for all of the staff that we expect to have hired and positions allocated, but we carry vacancies throughout the year. So the ending fund balance represents that unexpended amount or the amount saved from not filling that position. So that's one of the areas that goes into the unexpended budget. Then the other area are revenues received in excess of the budgeted amount. Including sometimes you may hear about the May adjustment, and that's when if there's additional revenues that the school district receives as part of the state funding formula, those would be budgeted into that as well. Expenditures are decreases in net financial resources, basically what we pay our bills with. So whether that's debt service or operating expenses, and then current or future use of assets and capital outlays. In the budget book, you will see expenditures referenced as requirements. And when we get down to revenues, those will be referenced as resources. So again, in the budget book, all of our revenues are identified as the resources. All of our expenditures are designated as the requirements. Liability is a debt or other legal obligation arising out of transactions in the past, which must be liquidated, renewed, or refunded at some future date. Revenues for the general fund budget, you can see those start on page 47, and these break down into both types of revenue and then sources of revenue. So the two different primary types of revenue are unrestricted, which means that they can be used for any legal purpose desired by the district without restriction. And then we have restricted revenue, which means they must be used for a categorical or specific purpose. If such money is not completely used, it must be returned. Some examples of that are Measure 98 dollars, High School Success, SIA, some of our federal dollars, Title I. Those are all restricted funds, which means they must be used for a very specific purpose. And if we do not expend them all at some point, they ask for them back. And then we have revenue sources, We have local sources, which are generally the local property taxes. We have intermediate sources, which are some local education or like WESD, Willamette ESD, the county school fund is another one that's an intermediate source of revenue. We have state sources. So that's primarily the state school fund, but there's other grants that come from the states as well. And then we have revenue from federal sources. Now within that, we do have unrestricted grants and aid. That's the revenue received as grants by the school district, which can be used for any legal purpose desired by the district without restriction. For the most part, this is the state school fund. And then restricted grants and aid are revenues received to grants by the district from state funds that must be used for categorical or specific purpose. So a lot of our special education or transportation grants, stuff like that. So those are restricted grants and aid. Next up is the revenue, which I went, nope, state school fund. So state school fund, you can find represented in the budget book starting on page 46. It's a major appropriation of state support for public schools. The grants are distributed to schools on a per student basis, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. It's a formula adopted by the legislature. It includes monies from local property taxes and other local revenues, including state general fund dollars. Important to note, sorry about my cat, is the state school fund represents about 65% of our general fund revenue. And then finally, we have interfund transfers, which are amounts distributed from one fund to another fund without services rendered. So examples of that are transfers into our asset replacement fund for curriculum, technology, transfers to other funds such as preventative and deferred maintenance, et cetera. And you can find the outgoing transfers from the general fund on page 90. And then you can find incoming transfers or an example of incoming transfers on page 112, which is into our asset replacement fund. So that gives you an idea of how you can track where they're leaving the general fund budget and where they're coming in to some of the other funds that they're being transferred to. And with that, I will hand it back over to Suzanne.
Thank you.
Funding sources.
Yep, thank you for that overview. Before we move on into our different funding sources, just to tie this up a little bit, the vocabulary, the language that we use in public finance is just different enough from the vocabulary that we use in our personal finance that we wanted to start here and really ground you in some of the terms that you're going to hear quite a lot over the next few months. We also wanted to begin pointing you towards the budget book. Much of our conversation, we will be referring back to the budget book. We'll be referring to this year's budget book as we engage in learning. And then when the official budget process starts, we'll have a new budget book for you to look at. We'll build that out as it gets closer to that process. But it's important that you understand how to navigate it because you can find many of the answers to your own questions just by knowing how to flow through the budget book. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the different funding sources that we have available. As our Chief Operations Officer mentioned, we have both state and federal funds that we use to educate students. On a very high level here, you'll see that just at a glance, the largest fund that we have access to is the state school fund. Again, that comprises more than 60% of the resources that we have access to. And then all of these smaller funding sources make up the totality of our budget. So I want to spend a little bit of time digging into this. You have reference to this document, so you can either look at it online or you can reference it from a print copy. So let's go ahead and turn to the next one. So starting with our state school resources, again, it's our largest source of revenue. And it is a source of revenue that is largely unrestricted. We can use the state school fund to feed kids, buy books, buy furniture, pay our staff. We can use it to improve instruction through professional learning. There are virtually no restrictions to how we use the state school fund. It is intended for the purpose of instructing students and for the continuity of operations. We also have several restricted state funds that we access, and those are the smaller hexagons that you see there off on the side. Some of these grants have been around for a while. SIA, for example, we've had access to for several years now. High School Success has been around. Head Start Preschool has been around for a while. You'll notice that there's a new grant on there, the Early Literacy Grant. A couple of months ago, Deputy Superintendent Cobb came before this body and shared information about the Early Literacy Grant and our plans to support the early literacy development of our students. That grant will be available to us soon, so we will weave that in and braid that into our overall budgeting and expenditure plan so that we can really support those early literacy skills for our young people. Next slide, please. We also have access to federal resources. Federal resources are restricted funds, and they are restricted to student populations primarily. You'll see there the list of student focal groups that these funds are intended to support, everything from students with disabilities to students who are experiencing houselessness to neglected and delinquent youth. There is one amount of money within Title IV and Title II that is specifically earmarked for well-rounded education and student safety and health. That is a smaller amount of money for us, and those monies are tied directly to the amount of money that we receive through Title I-A. All of these different federal sources that you see, because they are tied to a student population, the amount of resource that we receive, the amount of revenue that we receive, is based on the number of students that we have in our system who need this additional support. An example would be Title I-A. Title I-A is earmarked specifically for students who are experiencing poverty. Because we have a large number of our students in our district, 39,000, and because we have a significant number of those students who are experiencing poverty or economically disadvantaged, we receive a significant amount of Title I-A monies. Those monies have averaged between $12 and $15 million, depending on a given year. So we take these restricted funds and we braid them into our overall plan, but it is really critical that the funds go to the students for whom they are intended. So we can't just move them around within our system. We have to be really intentional about how we spend these monies, and then we have to report on how we spend these monies and how they support students. So before I go any further, I'm going to pause right here with those two different funding sources. Are there questions that we can collect from you and bring answers back the next time we meet?
Do you want us to just unmute and ask, or would you like us to use the chat?
Please go ahead and unmute and ask your question. We do have somebody who's capturing those for us.
Okay. I'm Catherine Jones, and the ESSER funds, I would like to know more about how, what kind of restrictions came with those, and how those were implemented, if they were used to pay for positions or what they went toward while they were flowing into our schools.
Great question, and I think we're going to answer that in just a moment here.
Okay.
What other questions do you have?
For me, that's it. With,
okay.
ESSER.
Dr. Chandragiri, jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Dr. West, I would like to know this Title I funds, which you mentioned. There are some schools with very dense population of children in poverty, but then there are also children who experience poverty, but they are scattered in other schools. So how does this work? Like those ones, do you consider a critical number of children like a population density and then you call that a title school, and then they get a differential funding, or these dollars follow the children wherever they are?
Okay, we will bring back that answer. Thank you, Dr. Chandragiri. What other questions?
Kelly Strawn, I'm curious how elastic these federal funds are when a presidential administration changes. Like, are these pretty constant? I mean, we're in an election year, we're making a budget. Do we expect these to remain constant? Do we expect there's any chance that they change, or what's the period at which you count on them going forward before they would change and they could be built into a reliable budget?
That's a great question. I'm going to pause here because I can answer that quickly. The actual allocation to each of these federal revenue sources may fluctuate based on the amount of money that's appropriated in the federal Congress. So we do see some fluctuation up and down in the amount of money that we receive. The funding streams, for example, Title I-A, Title III, IDEA for individuals with disabilities, those are written into federal legislation. So in order for those to change, there would have to be changes to the law. So it's unlikely that we would see changes there because it would take an act of Congress to change the law. But we do see fluctuations in the amount of money that we receive. What other questions can we answer?
I just want to, is it okay? Hi, everybody. Just to piggyback that, and that's partially why, and when we review the budget for the future year, do we generally have a comprehension of what those are? I assume that we know the laws of the year. Okay, so that's part of the review process, so we don't get ourselves caught in a permanent spending for, okay. Good. So I'll be anxious to hear more about that. And you know me, I always have lots of questions, but I'm hidden for a little bit and we'll see if it comes out. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay.
I would piggyback the head nods there. Yes, we generally know what they are. Sometimes we don't know what they are until very late in the budgeting cycle, because it also depends on how fast the federal government is processing their budgeting. So sometimes it can come very late. So it can be a guess at times if they have not passed their budget by the time we need to pass ours.
So then we probably don't plan to spend those unless we do get it at the end. We probably have like a wish list where we can pull from and say, ooh, guess what? Today we found out we have these funds. Now we're going to implement it here as our preferred place and kind of go down the list.
A little modification to that, Director Hudson. We make an educated guess based on what we've received in the past, and we make a conservative guess so that if the funding comes in below what we would estimate it to be, that we're not caught off guard, to get back to what you were saying. So it's a both and, I think, to your question. But this is a great example. We are right now waiting for the federal government to pass a budget. So we are also waiting for the state to tell us what our official allocation is. Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll go ahead and move on to ESSER. If you do have questions, mark them down. We'll pause again and collect those here in just a little bit. Slide to come up. While it's coming up, since the question was asked about ESSER, here's the information that you need to know. ESSER is a temporary funding source. It's been talked about a lot in the media, especially from the very first grant, which was a small amount of money, all the way to the third grant. This is commonly called ESSER 3. Over the past 18 months or so, as the first two ESSER allocations have expired, we're just generally calling this ESSER. But these are temporary funds that were intended to support unfinished learning, continuity of operations, and health and safety needs. These funds expire the 30th of September, 2024, so this year. After the expiration date, we'll have a little bit of time. The federal government will allow us 60 to 90 days to finish paying our bills, but we can't incur any new expenses after the 30th of September. For us, we utilize these funds for unfinished learning. About 42% of the funds we received went towards unfinished learning, and that was everything from reducing class size in grades K2 across our system to employing graduation coaches to help our seniors finish well and finish strong. The question was asked about whether we use these resources to pay for nurses. We did use some of these resources to pay for nurses. We also use some of these resources to buy all of the health and safety needs that immediately rose to our attention at the start of the pandemic, like masks and air filters and hand sanitizer. The use of these funds has been pretty flexible within these large categories, again, with the requirement that a minimum of 20% be spent on unfinished learning, and we've spent more than double of that minimum requirement. Okay, next slide, please. So budget building blocks. We're going to start to get into here how money is actually allocated to us as a school district. At the state level, what the co-chairs do, if you read the news about how the budget is allocated, you'll often hear about the co-chairs. And it's the co-chairs within our state Congress that put forth a recommended budget. The way that they determine the recommended budget for the state school fund is they run an algorithm that they call the current service level. The current service level generally is the amount of money needed in the upcoming biennium, so they allocate in 2-year periods, to continue existing authorized programs into the next biennium. And they use a calculation to determine that. The state actually has a 20-year look back within their CSL model, so they are averaging expenses over a 20-year period when they do their calculation, and that will become relevant here in just a couple of minutes. So they start with the prior biennium state school fund. They estimate percentages of increase for multiple variables. You see some of them there. And then they propose an allocation for the new biennium. Next slide, please. So the district CSL generally has the same definition. This is also our effort to forecast what it would cost for us to maintain the same level of service to students that we're currently providing. We include in our CSL salaries, benefits, associated payroll costs. For reference, associated payroll costs are all of the additional costs associated with the people that we employ beyond wages. So that's the cost of benefits, it's the cost of unemployment insurance, it's the cost of workers' compensation. All of that gets rolled up into the overall cost for an individual that we employ, and we refer to that as associated payroll costs. And then we know that there will be some level of inflation for costs and goods and services, so we roll that up, and then growth, the growth that we have within our system. The district CSL accurately reflects roll-up costs because we know our direct expenses. The state is not calculating a CSL for Salem-Keizer. The state is calculating a CSL based on sampling and averages within the state. So the CSL that we identify is usually different at the outset from the CSL that the state identifies. There is work that's done every biennium to bring those closer together, if not to actually meet what the different school districts say that they need. But we usually start pretty far apart in what we think the CSL is. Move forward, please, to the next slide. So here's an example of the types of differences that the state and school districts around the state experience as we work on CSL. You've heard us talk, if you've been paying attention to our efforts to right-size our budget, that what we're experiencing right now is largely the result of errors in calculation in the CSL. And this is a great example. The current service level that the state calculated for this biennium had personnel increases rising at a rate of 2.78% for school year 23-24, the one that we're currently in. and rising at a rate of 2.67% for the next school year, the one coming up. Again, if you've been following the news or reading the information that we've shared publicly, we have offered to our associations increases above and beyond this, and we're not unusual in the state in doing so. Portland Public is another good example. Their 3-year contract for their teachers over the course of that 3 years was well over 12%. So what we're seeing here is that 20-year average, again, that's how the state determines what the CSL is. It's a 20-year look back to determine what do they think the increase in cost will be. Doesn't match the fiscal reality that school districts are experiencing, us being a great example of that. Next slide, please.
All right. So at the state level, now that they calculated the CSL and it goes through the legislature and ends up with a legislatively approved budget, then comes the question of how that money gets allocated to the school district. So district allocations from ODE are based on the average daily membership weighted. So I'm going to define those. So the average daily membership is a measure of student enrollment, but it's the average enrollment over the course of the school year or the time period up to the point of measurement. So average daily membership weighted, we'll look at it on the next screen. And that's how our funding model from the state school fund is distributed to us. So once we take our ADM, which is submitted to the state, they increase it by identified weighted factors. So they start with a 1.0 weighting for every student. And then for other categories or other attributes of students or needs of the students, they add additional weights. So a special education or a student that needs special education services receives an additional 1.0 weighting. English language learners is 0.5, pregnant impaired things. So you can see some of the different weighting models that exist there. Now that ADMW, the way the state school fund works is in order to protect school districts with declining enrollment, which Salem-Keizer is currently in declining enrollment, they take the higher of the current or prior year ADMW calculation. So for us, because we're in declining enrollment, our fiscal year 23 ADMW is going to be higher than our fiscal year 24. And for school districts, when they're growing, it takes the higher number, which is going to be the current year, if we're expected to grow in our ADM next year. So once the ODE calculates our ADMW, they take the state school fund that was appropriated to them, and then they basically divvy that up across the school districts. And historically, that money, once they determine each district allocation, it's allocated over the course of the biennium at a ratio of 49% in year 1 and 51% in year 2. And again, that allocation comes out of the legislatively approved budget, I believe. All right, so that's coming up on our time because we did want to leave time for questions, but we do want to, next slide, please.
Bob, can I, before we move on, can I go back to just one thing that you referenced here?
Of course.
Speaking again about the state school fund and the conversation that many of you have probably been paying attention to about the need to reform, our governor has talked about that. It became a priority topic during the strike in Portland Public. These weighted funds are a good example of why the conversation is necessary. If you look at special education, you see there is an additional weight for special education. So students who receive special education in the district are funded at the 1.0 weight that we get for every student, and then an additional 1.0 weight, so essentially double weight. However, there's a cap on the percentage of students that the state will fund within a special education program within a district. And many districts in the state, like Salem-Keizer, are above that cap. So we average in a given year between 16 and 17% of our students receiving special education services. The cap is far below that. The cap is at 13%. So if the state, and this is part of the conversation that's taking place, if the state were to remove that cap, that would be an additional $50 million for Salem-Keizer over the course of a biennium based on the number of students receiving special education services. So that doesn't help us develop a budget because the money we get is the money we get, and we're not going to see a change in the state school funding formula in the short session, and it may not even be in the 25 session, although we hope that we can get to that point. The reason for bringing this to your attention is that there's a lot of conversation that we hear and a lot of questions that come up around, well, isn't the money enough? And how are you utilizing these monies? And doesn't the state give you extra money for students that need a little bit more than the average student? This helps you contextualize how complex the conversation is and how many variables that the state has to contend with when they determine how to allocate to a school district, but also then that we have to contend with. Thank you for letting me interrupt you, Bob.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out. Next slide, please. So some of the future brown bag topics that, Cynthia, go ahead. Sorry.
Can we go back to the last slide?
Yeah. And we'll go ahead and pause for questions.
Question. We know that students can be in more than one category. So how do we determine which category that they would be placed in? So you could be special ed and you could be an English language learner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
the question you're asking is, do we receive multiple weights for a student with what we call intersectionality? So some of our students, as you said, they may be receiving foster care. They may also qualify as a student in poverty, and they may be receiving special education services. That is the crux of your question, correct, Director Richardson?
That is correct.
Okay, yeah, we'll certainly bring back the answer to that question when we meet again.
Director Chandra-Giri?
Yeah. I just, I mean, it's a similar thing, you know, so they can have more than one. And how many of those weights can a child be added to a child? And is there a similar weight with the federal money that we get? Or is it only, can they get a federal extra money and also state's weight for the same child?
Okay. Bob, since this seems to be a topic of interest, maybe we could pause here for just a minute and talk about weights and then the restricted funds we get from the federal government. So the weights, the monies that we get from the federal government are first sent to the state. So what the federal government does is they look at, they take samples for a state and they say, okay, the state has X amount of students who are experiencing economically disadvantaged circumstances. And the federal calculation is an acronym known as SAPI, Small Area Income Poverty Estimate is what it stands for. Glad I remembered that. So the federal government uses that calculation to say, here are the number of students that are economically disadvantaged within the state of Oregon, and they send money to the state. The state then determines, based on the amount of money that they receive and based on the factors that we talked about before, how much money Salem-Keizer gets, how much money Portland Public gets, how much money Klamath Falls gets. So they allocate out based on the number of students in our districts that are economically disadvantaged. That is different than the weight that we receive for these different student categories within the state school fund. So we receive those restricted funds from the federal government for a very specific purpose. Title III is a good example of that. Title III is earmarked specifically for students who are learning English. We must use those monies to support student learning of English. That is their intended purpose. But you can see here that we also get a 0.5 weight from the state within the state school fund for students who are English learners. That money comes to us in the unrestricted state school fund for us to use more flexibly in the way that we support our English learners in our system. We still have to account with the state for how we utilize those extra monies, but we have a little more flexibility because it's a state fund. Does that answer the questions that we had on the table? And Director Richardson, your question about intersectionality is that when the state allocates their monies, they don't pull students out of their allocation methodology if they appear in multiple collections. That's how the state finds out how many students we have. And the overall amount of intersectionality within our system and other school districts doesn't significantly impact the amount of money that we receive. I see Kelly Strawn.
Yeah, thank you. Feel free to ignore this for now. I'm not sure this is germane immediately, but I'm really curious. It's one thing to say that we have 17% of one category of student, and the allocation, the weighted allocation is 13%. I find myself wondering, how do we know that the actual weights are even correct? I look at special education, it's exactly a 1-for-1. So if you are a special education student in Salem-Keizer, the presumption of this calculation is that you cost 100% more than a non-special ed student. Do we even know that that is right? Like, what's the basis for these weights? I imagine there's a history behind it. I imagine it's all part of writing legislation and somebody wanting to sort of, create a nice, neat formula for this. But I don't know. I guess I may not need to know this in order to understand what this process is and to participate in this discussion, but I'm very curious as to whether or not that's going to be part of the discussion, not merely are the caps causing problems, but are the weights even right? Like maybe they're too high, maybe they're too low. I mean, what's the basis for these? It seems like that's a more important question, or not more important, but equally valuable question as is, can we remove the caps? Why are we capping in the first place?
Right, man, excellent question. I appreciate that. And that is a question that we are asking at the state level. As I said, Governor Kotek has pulled together a group of people, and Director Richardson, I know, knows quite a bit about this with her work at the state level. The governor's pulled together a group of people, and they right now are examining the state school fund to answer exactly the question that you're asking. Are these allocations correct? Are they right for our state? And do they move the resources that we have to the students that need them most in the way that they're intended? So we are grateful that the governor is calling for this work to be done. We think it's time, and we've given you a couple of examples of why we think it's time. But it will also take the state a couple of sessions through Congress to get to the point where they'll have a recommendation for a change.
And I want to expand on that. It's a great question, Kelly, and one that's not completely answered by the state, but a portion. So the state school fund primarily goes into our general fund, but there's certain portions of it that are carved out of it specifically for transportation. So all of our transportation reimbursement is a subsection of the state school fund, as well as a high cost disability grant. So they are, I don't know when they passed the legislation, but they did try to address that question specifically that you asked in the creation of the high cost disability grant. And so that provides some reimbursement opportunities for students that are very much exceeding the 1.0 weighting. And I believe the amount is 30,000. That, you know, that's the threshold for when you can apply for reimbursement for those students. So they do try to address your question and recognize that that 1.0 weighting may not completely cover the additional expenses through that high cost disability grant, which is, again, part of the state school fund allocation that ODE receives.
Right.
So, Catherine?
Thank you for that. Sorry, my camera's off. I'm at karate practice with my daughter. So, so these weights are applied to money coming out of the Common School Fund, which I have an ignorant question. That doesn't go through ODE to you guys, right? That comes, I assume, directly from the state, from DAS?
Correct. Bob's shaking his head. So it doesn't come from DAS, but it does come from the state.
Okay. But not ODE, because I was looking through ODE's budget and they have, you know, about 4.9 billion in a grant and aid. And a lot of that is from the Student Success Act. So those monies distributed to you guys do not have these weights in them. Is that correct? It's just money coming out of the Common School Fund.
Correct. This is state school fund. So high school success, student investment account, those do not include these weights in the allocation. And Bob, I think you want to expand on the response there.
No, you nailed it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
What other questions should we collect for our next couple of sessions? Director Hudson?
Hi, I'm just going to toss in one that I know we've talked about before. If we could, I think it would be awesome to be able to actually review together a closer look at an itemization, in a sense, of ESSER funds distribution, so that we can, because I don't know how else I should word this, but just to try to use this opportunity, I feel like it would be wise to analyze, to make sure that we, to try to help moving forward. I want to, I don't know if I should elaborate since we're live. I don't want to make this, I think it would be, I think it's a question I know I have, but I feel like a lot of folks have, but I just was thinking maybe that would help us understand and comprehend focal points moving forward to help as a whole unit together as a group, for where maybe are they all one kind of payment things, or do we still have any stuck and ongoing things that we started with those ESSER funds and things like that. Also, you know, really hopefully we don't have another issue like you mentioned earlier, Bob, but say we do, we want to make sure that we can get through it the best way possible and maybe learn a little bit from this scenario that we just are coming out of.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to repeat what I think are several questions, and please let me know if I've captured all of them. So one question that I think you're asking is, are there any existing expenses that would ordinarily be rolled forward? And in terms of our budget process, do we intend to roll those forward? And what would that look like since ESSER funds are expiring? Versus one-time expenses that we might have that we can simply set aside because the ESSER funding is expiring. I think that's one question that you have. The other question that you have is to develop an understanding of how we utilized the ESSER funds, how we expended them over the course of the pandemic and the years following.
Absolutely.
Just to develop an understanding of where those resources were utilized in our system. Did I capture that correctly, Director Hudson?
Exactly. Thank
you. Okay, yeah, we'll come back with those answers. Thank you for the questions.
Okay. So we got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to move us to the next slide. I believe we have 5 minutes left.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So we've identified 2 areas that we think would be extremely beneficial for budget committee members. And that's one, how we forecast and build a budget. And for that, we'll bring in Sarah Head to give a really high level but technical overview of how the district goes about presenting a budget to you for approval and adoption. And then another area of the budget, obviously staffing plays a large role in our budget. Last year, our audit report shows that they played 90% role in our budget. So having you understand the intersection between budget and our staffing models, I think will be really important. And we also just wanted to ask you what would be beneficial for a future topic that we could prepare and bring back for the committee.
Director Chandragiri.
We can end the slides here.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, the community members often ask me, how much does per child bring with one weight without any additional weightage? That's like 1.0. How much does the state give us? Not all the restricted fund. And then how much does it cost? At least in my mind, I know it costs more than what the state gives. That's why we have to do some mixing and matching. But I don't have an answer, the dollar amount. I try to ask folks. Nobody can give it because nobody can say with certainty because things change. And is there a way you can give us over the years? Because all we have is the quality education model versus what the state assess, what is the state school fund. And essentially it's like a flat line with the widening gap. But the state has never funded even according to the quality education model which it created. So when people ask me how much does the child bring versus how much does it cost per child without any additional weightage, that way people say, you know, and it's a very confusing question and a lot of people come up with different numbers. So it'll be helpful if something you can show us. That way at least people know, okay, this is what it is. And without the weightages.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll capture that question, Director Chandragiri, and make sure that you get an answer.
And again, the importance of attendance. Why attendance is very important, not only for the child, but for the other children also. Because the entire funding depends on the attendance. And if the attendance starts tanking middle of the year, the number will drop.
To be clear, just to make sure we have accurate information, student attendance doesn't directly affect the amount of money that we receive. ADM affects the amount of money we receive. And ADM is a measure of enrollment. So students who don't attend school regularly may be dropped from enrollment. So there's a relationship there, but it's not a one-to-one correlation. But we can certainly talk a little bit more about that.
And we often fall off the cliff. It takes about a year plus before we fall off the cliff because of the previous year's enrollment may be better. So it kind of buffers us, but gives us a false sense of security financially until it suddenly drops. Then if there is an increased enrollment, it takes a while for it to show. That's how I understand. If you can
so the question there, sorry to interrupt, Director Chandragiri. I think your question is, how does the state ensure that spikes in enrollment up or down do not adversely impact a school district? And we can bring that information to this group as well. There is only 1 minute left in the amount of time that we had planned. So in just a moment, I'm going to send it back to Chair Guzman-Ortiz. But what I'd ask in the meantime is if you have questions that you would like to have us wrestle with, the process to send questions to us is to email our chair and our superintendent and our executive assistant, Ashley Stoven, directly, and they'll make sure that the questions get to us.
Questions or topics.
Or topics, thank you. All right, Chair Guzman-Ortiz, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the information. Lots of great questions captured. I was even taking notes because this information is substantial and there's just always more. I think just the more that you hear, and it takes a couple times to really hone it in. So thanks for taking the time Dr. West and Bob Silva for joining us, and then all board members and budget committee members who were able to make it this evening. So it is 7:01. The meeting is adjourned, and look forward to seeing you at the brown bag conversations as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
For more videos and information, go to capitalcommunitymedia.org and follow us on social media.